Candlelight vigil on the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown. High security alerts on the streets of Beijing. And the U.S. to boost its military deployments in Europe.
Good evening. Thousands of people are gathered at Victoria Park for the annual Candlelight Vigil to remember the victims of the Tiananmen Square crackdown some 25 years ago. Organisers expect a good turnout tonight, with many expressing a desire never to forget what happened in Beijing a quarter of a century ago. To tell us more, we're joined by Joao da Silva, who's standing by in Victoria Park. Joao, so what's the scene out there right now?
Good evening. Still half an hour to go for the official start of this year's vigil, and judging from the crowds here, the aspirations and the memory of the 1989 student movement are alive and well in Hong Kong. Despite rifts among the main pro-democracy groups, most have agreed to take part, and they were joined by the main student unions. This at a time when polls indicate a diminishing interest on the June 4th among people in Hong Kong. We talked to some of those who arrived here earlier, and they told us why it is worth remembering 25 years on. People started pouring into Victoria Park this afternoon for tonight's candlelight vigil.
It's quite incredible that we can still do this in Hong Kong while it's China, right? But we have to keep pushing to keep this freedom, push for democracy, and then hopefully maybe in China one day they will have this basic right, the freedom of speech.
If we do not join this meeting, people will forget gradually. So we should join here every year in order to show to China government that we will not forget this.
Apart from locals, some mainlanders also made their way here to learn about the Tiananmen Square crackdown.
I think it's a very good effort for Hong Kong to hold these things, and I think it's a good effort to let the mainland to know more about this.
The Voice of Loving Hong Kong, a group which supports the central government's decision to crack down on the student protest movement in 1989, set up a stall outside of Victoria Park. They got into a yelling match with those heading to the vigil. Police had to step in and separate the two groups. One person was taken away, but vigil organisers are confident things will be peaceful tonight.
I'm not worried about that, because I think the people of Hong Kong are very much of a restrained and rational, and we call upon people to come into the Victoria Park. Our struggle is to light the candle to to protest against the suppression in 1989, and also to protest against suppression today.
Earlier today, University of Hong Kong students held a memorial ceremony for the crackdown. They painted the words "In memory of June 4th" on Swire Bridge. The University Student Union called on Hong Kong people to be united in fighting for vindication of the student movement. The sheer number of people here right now is impressive, already covering 2 football pitches according to the people on stage. And if this weather holds up, it could increase. The organisers estimated earlier that 150,000 could be joining this year's vigil. And a quick reminder, if you're planning to come, it is advisable to take public transportation due to special traffic arrangements around Victoria Park. That's all from me. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Joao. That was Joao da Silva reporting live out at Victoria Park. And in Beijing, authorities have been on high alert the whole day after calls were made online for people to visit Tiananmen Square dressed in black. This as the UN human rights chief urged China to learn from its past. Security was visibly tighter than usual as tourists arrived early in the morning to watch the 5 a.m. flag-raising ceremony. Plainclothes officers check people's identity inside the square throughout the day. Outside, a police car was deployed every 20 meters in the more crowded areas. Some Hong Kong reporters were barred from entering the square, a move that drew criticism from the Hong Kong Journalists Association. Dissident Hu Jiao, who called on people to visit Tiananmen Square dressed in black today, put up photos of his friends who went on social media platforms, saying he was under house arrest and unable to take part himself. Zhang Xianling, whose son died in the 1989 crackdown on the student-led pro-democracy demonstrations, said authorities took her and other families to the graves of their loved ones, where they remembered the deceased under the eagle eyes of police officers. But leader of the Tiananmen Mothers Group, Ding Ziling, who is in Jiangsu province, was reportedly stopped from going to Beijing to visit her son's grave, the first time in 25 years she hasn't been able to do so. Some who survived the crackdown feel guilty for leaving the mainland. Former student leader Wu Kaixi, who fled abroad and is now in Taiwan, has never been able to return to his homeland since then.
I was being called the leader of that movement, and then I felt that I'm the captain of a sank ship. Why didn't I die? That question I probably will answer for the rest of my life. I'll probably leave the rest of my life with that survivor's guilt.
United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillay waded in on the historic event. In a statement, the former South African High Court judge said Chinese authorities should encourage and facilitate dialogue and discussion as a means of overcoming the legacy of the past. She added that learning from history will not diminish the gains of the past 25 years, but will show how far China has come. She called on Beijing to release the many dissidents who have been detained since the days running up to June 4th. Beijing did not take kindly to her words. Foreign Minister spokesman Hong Lei called Pillay's statement a serious violation of China's sovereignty. He insisted all those being held have broken the law and they're not the so-called people with different political opinions.
Now back in Hong Kong, all 1,192 proposed amendments to the appropriation bill have now been struck down at the Legislative Council. LegCo President Tang Yuk-sing expects the deliberation on the bill to end later tonight. Stephanie Choi reports.
The 14th day of the filibuster started off with the Labour Party's Lee Chuk-yan calling for a minute of silence to commemorate those who lost their lives in the June 4th crackdown 25 years ago. His request was dismissed by LegCo President Tang Yuk-sing, who said such a tribute could only be made in special circumstances, such as the death of a legislator or an influential person in Hong Kong. Lawmaker Regina Ip said Tang made the right move in rejecting Lee's request.
His request for a moment's silence in mourning was outside the established policy of LegCo.
Some 50 amendments to the appropriation bill remained on the agenda today. Legislators voted on more than 30 amendments within the first hour, drawing the 124-hour filibuster to a close. The New Democrats' Gary Fan put forward the final amendment, which was negatived. Legislative councillors finished voting on a total of 1,192 amendments. Legislator Wong Kwok-hing claimed the filibuster has cost more than $30 million worth of public funds and accused the LegCo president of not cutting short the filibuster earlier. Some lawmakers questioned how Wong arrived at that figure. They also questioned some pro-establishment lawmakers' knowledge on the LegCo president's role.
If you don't sit here, you don't listen to the debate, you don't have a meeting here, what would you have done which would be more beneficial and more constructive? We don't know. Those figures just do not exist. You won't be able to come up with those figures under any commercial modeling.
Some members, including some DB members, are not quite clear about the role and status of the president of the legislature. They think that they are the chairman of the National People's Deputy.
Pro-establishment lawmakers later called on the Legco president to review the mechanism for cutting short filibusters. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
South Koreans have been voting in local elections, which are seen as a referendum on President Park Geun-hye's administration and her government's handling of the deadly ferry disaster in April. The sinking of the ferry Sewol has put traditional campaign issues such as jobs, education, and welfare on the sidelines of the election. Instead, the disaster, which claimed more than 300 lives, has focused attention on a debate over the perceived failure of South Korea to enforce safety standards.
Syria has held a presidential election in government-controlled areas amid the ongoing civil war there. President Bashar al-Assad is widely expected to win a third 7-year term, but rebels and many around the world have dismissed the poll as a sham. Tony Sabine reports.
Polls closed late yesterday in Syria's presidential election, but the result seems a sure thing for President Bashar al-Assad. He faced two challenges, but in a carefully choreographed election amid a brutal civil war, any semblance of a challenge was just for show. Indeed, the poll was ignored and mocked in opposition-held areas, with some rebels dropping their shoes in a phony ballot box in a show of disgust. The international community was just as dismissive.
Today's presidential election in Syria is a disgrace. Bashar al-Assad has no more credibility today than he did yesterday. Elections should be an opportunity for the people of a free society to be consulted and to play an important role in choosing their leaders. Instead, such a process was inconceivable today in Syria, where the regime continued to reject the courageous calls for freedom and dignity that started more than 3 years ago.
While U.S. officials condemned the election, the former American ambassador to Damascus harshly criticized Washington's Syria policy, saying the White House should have done more earlier to support the more moderate factions of the Syrian insurgency. Robert Ford said in an interview that as a result of U.S. hesitancy, extremist threats to the United States had grown because of the rise of radical elements who had come to dominate the Syrian rebel agenda. Tony Sabine, TVB News.
U.S. President Barack Obama pledged to boost American military deployments in Europe in an effort to ease the fears of allies rattled by Russia's intervention in Ukraine. Obama is in Poland on the first stop of a 4-day European tour. Alan Booknia reports.
Under attack from critics at home who say his leadership on the world stage hasn't been muscular enough, Obama unveiled plans to spend up to $1 billion in military exercises and support for NATO states on Russia's borders. He added that while maintaining sanctions against the Kremlin, he still wants good relations with Moscow.
We recognize that Russia has legitimate interests in what happens along its borders and has a long historic relationship with Ukraine. But we also believe that the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty have to be respected.
Several European leaders plan to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin later this week. Obama and Putin are not expected to hold a formal meeting when they both attend the 70th anniversary of the D-Day invasion on Friday. But the two leaders are expected to have some interaction. Obama also met briefly today with Ukraine's President-elect Petro Poroshenko. They discussed ways the U.S. can help train Ukrainian law enforcement and military personnel. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Russia's UN ambassador said he hopes Obama's European tour doesn't worsen the situation.
If the policy is to sort of build up NATO to take advantage of this dramatic situation in Ukraine in order to beef up the muscles of NATO, because I think that is going to be detrimental for the overall international interaction. But
Churkin has been meeting with members of the UN Security Council to try to reach agreement to end the fighting between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian militants in eastern Ukraine. He said so far the talks have not been encouraging. Alan Booknia, TVB News.
A huge fire broke out at a Royal Dutch Shell chemical plant in the Netherlands last night. The fire erupted after an explosion at the sprawling 790-acre plant. Flames could be seen 30 kilometers away in Rotterdam. The plant manufactures chemicals from oil for use in products ranging from car components to insulation materials. The cause of the explosion